Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for this program that we're really excited to bring to you. This program started as a conversation between ADL Philadelphia and the JCRC of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia. But people were so excited about what we were doing that we've expanded it to the entire ADL Mid-Atlantic Midwest Division, which encompasses really from the Carolinas to the Dakotas. And all 5 of those regions are participating, as are JCRCs from all over those areas. You saw the list earlier. So I want to thank all our co-sponsors. The idea for this series, and it is 2 parts, is that if you're going to fight anti-Semitism, you need to fight it from wherever it comes from, even and especially if it comes from people with whom you're usually aligned or agree with or work with in coalition or in partnership. Kenny Jacobson, what I call the dean of the ADL, somebody who's worked at the ADL for 50 years, a few years ago wrote an op-ed about this and talked about if you're serious about fighting anti-Semitism, you need to not just call out the other side, but call in the people you work with. And so we've come up with a 2-part series to talk to people who have done that, who have experience with that, fighting anti-Semitism in the spaces that they think are important to be in and to work in. So tonight we're talking about fighting anti-Semitism in progressive spaces, and we have a terrific panel. We're going to have part 2 on November 18th, and we're going to have a discussion that we'll tell you about a little bit later, and we hope you'll join us for that as well as we talk about fighting anti-Semitism on the right. But I do want to note that our 3 panelists tonight, 2 of them do work at the ADL. At the beginning of this process, none of the 3 panelists did. But so think about their prior roles as well. And they'll tell you what they used to do, and you'll understand why they're here tonight. And I want to thank them for their courage in talking about this. I want to remind the audience that this is not an easy thing to talk about. But again, it's so important to think about anti-Semitism being from all spaces and needing to be fought in all spaces. And the credibility you have when you're willing to call out people that you work with, that you agree with, when you make yourself vulnerable to that, and the power that that can have. And so we all share that responsibility, and I hope we'll take it seriously and really get a lot of work done over the course of tonight and our upcoming program and in the spaces where we work every day. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Carly Pildis, and thank you all for being here.
I was still muted. First of all, let me just say what an honor it is to be here with 2 really incredible and insightful speakers on the progressive movement, on anti-Semitism in America, and they happen to be 2 of my dearest friends. When we started this process, neither of us worked at the ADL, so Alex, watch out. And I just have to say, it's such a great thing to be here and be talking about these problems openly, honestly, and unflinchingly. Prior to my time at ADL, I was the director of grassroots organizing for the Jewish Democratic Council of America. I also worked at Zioness, a progressive organizing group called Results for Obama for America, on and on. I'll let the other tell you a little bit about themselves, but Manny has a long history in Democratic Party politics, more campaigns than I could count, on and on and on, and deep Minnesota Democratic Party roots. Alex, as you probably know, is a columnist for Forward and just a great observer of anti-Semitism, the progressive movement, and Jewish life as we know it. So it's so wonderful to have both of you here. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having us, Carly, and everybody else.
I want to start off really with some scene setting. You know, I think when we talk about the left and we talk about progressivism, it can mean so many different things to so many people. So I really want to start with, who is the American left? What do they care about? What are some of the points of contention as well as points of collaboration with the American Jewish community? Alex, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I think, it's a great question in that the way that things get discussed, you have these kinds of catch-alls like the left and the right, and they're useful shorthands for talking about more complex kinds of phenomenons. But when talking about the quote-unquote left in America, you're talking about a lot of different kinds of groups with competing agendas, with different priorities, with different policy goals. And very often when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we talk about anti-Semitism on the left as a big catch-all, as if this is one big monolithic kind of group. And I think coming from the Jewish world, you should be skeptical of folks talking about any kind of group being monolithic. We have our own divisions on a lot of different kinds of issues. We have our own different kinds of priorities. When talking through in American politics, broadly in electoral politics, the left is a large coalition. Different parts of it come to prominence at different points in time, but it is a bunch of different groups, geographically different, racially different, religiously different, who come together for various kinds of policy goals. On the domestic agenda, that tends to be a lot more agreement, where you have a general focus on quality of living kinds of issues, affordable kinds of things for your life, healthcare, childcare, infrastructure, those kinds of things that are in the news a lot right now are general mainstream kinds of policy goals. With respect to foreign policy, it is a much smaller world of people. This tends to be folks who are concentrated around the DC area, who are active in progressive kinds of think tanks, who are active in various administrations, who formally or informally have close ties with the Democratic Party establishment, who have very high-minded kinds of debates on what is happening there, that talking about it as all one group is a messy thing and gets to imprecise kinds of points. With respect to anti-Semitism on the left in America, it is also a complicated thing because there's a lot of things that we call anti-Semitism on the left that may perhaps not be the left, quote unquote, or may not be anti-Semitic. It is a hard line and a lot of case-by-case kinds of encounters. So for example, you had a couple of years ago, an activist in the DC area who was talking about Jews controlling the weather. And there was a lot of coverage of, there's anti-Semitism on the left. There's a person running for, I believe it was city council. Carly, correct me if I'm wrong on this.
It was a sitting city council member who'd been endorsed by several local Jewish orgs. Continue.
Yes. And, this kind of broad sweeping coverage of look at this anti-Semitism on the left, like, of course, the Jews don't control the media. The guy was engaged with several groups, including the ADL, on the topic, eventually walked it back, but nobody walks back the indictment of the entire left across the entire country. And remember, in the 2020 election, we're talking about 81 million people who voted for the candidate of the left, that everybody agrees on this thing. Most people had never heard of it, and it's a silly kind of thing. And so a little bit of precision when talking about this and knowing when to understand of when is it worthwhile to be engaging, when is it worthwhile to be challenging, when is it worthwhile to be speaking out about it, is very case by case and requires some more information than just the headline of Jews control the weather. I'll pause there.
Manny, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, one thing I think is really key when we talk about folks on the left, right? And especially for me coming as a non-Jew, someone who's not Jewish and who cares what anti-Semitism is, how do we define movement versus campaigns, and how do we balance that movement? I think that mindset, that understanding is really important because we'll see why we have so many schisms within, we'll say, a progressive movement, right? We can talk about Women's March and in the wake of the 2016 election, I think is a really great example to kind of illustrate this. We had dozens upon dozens of grassroots organizations, all with their own agendas, come together and create a resistance movement. And in this movement, right, we had folks who, no doubt, undoubtedly, espouse anti-Semitic rhetoric. We can get into this in the weeds, but we came together and we had to find that balance. And not everyone was on the same page. So I think what Alex was saying really balances out there. The one point that I think is important to remember is that was what I would call a movement moment. And when those moments happen, how do we then use them to define what the next 5 steps that we're going to take on the left? And I think that's what we're going to get later on in this conversation. But I think that's really important as we use a guide to define who are we as the left, who are we as progressives, and then what is our compass? Because I think that's actually what defines the left. And it's something that we struggle with. And I think that's a bigger picture here.
I'm glad you brought up the Women's March, because for me, I find it as someone who, was a part of the movement to really hold leadership accountable, such a moment of, in the end, a moment of victory. We talk about like the Women's March and how there was so much anti-Semitism coming from leadership at times and how that was very frightening. And sometimes we don't talk enough about how what happened in the end was massive reform of the organization and many, many, many partners pulling out of the organization. So I do think I'm happy that you brought that up, bringing up some of the statements by Linda Sarsour, by Tamika Mallory, some of which they apologized for, many of which they didn't and continue to defend. So I do think it's worth talking about how, the asks that were eventually put forth from the Women's March were all eventually done, adding people to the board, changing out some leadership, etc. So I think it's worth mentioning for me that is a moment when people came together and helped to set a standard and said, this really isn't acceptable what's happening here. And, we need to see people take action on that. So, as we talk about who the left is, what do you think drives when anti-Semitism does bubble up on the left? What do you think drives that?
I'll say this. I always start, answering this question with, 3 years ago could not define anti-Semitism on the left, right? Today, I work for the Anti-Defamation League, arguably one of the leading organizations fighting anti-Semitism, not only in America, but across the world. So how did somebody like me, who couldn't name anti-Semitism on the left, get to this position? Learning and education. So anti-Semitism on the left, for me, in my perspective, always comes from a huge place of misunderstanding the history of all the times and continued times that anti-Semitism manifests itself, right? Age-old tropes of Jews controlling the weather, Jews controlling the government, all these things that, I'll be honest, 3 years ago would not click in my head. Carly, I actually believe that we had a conversation around Women's March specifically, where you asked me about the anti-Semitism coming from the left. And I said, Carly, I don't understand. We're not Nazis, right? We're not marching Jews will not replace us. And I actually had a gut check myself of like, wait, that's not what you're supposed to say as a progressive. You don't ask somebody and question their oppression. That being said, nobody is perfect. And so often on the left, as a coalition movement, right, as we think, well, what are all of our individual identities that we're bringing to the table? We're only experts in our own lived experience. And so I think as we continue to hit, anti-Semitism, Jews only make up, 6 million, some odd million people in the world, right? It's a very small population. And people who understand or are even connected to the Jewish community, right, and have a good, deep understanding, even more far and few in between. So I would say that's my first reaction is we have to build these bases of understanding to fight all the different things that already are mainstream, that we know are anti-Semitic, that we know feed into the anti-Jewish rhetoric that is so pervasive in our society.
I think a part of what Manny's whole story, which we'll get into more later, really brings forth for me is, there's such a ignorance about who Jews are, what anti-Semitism is, how it manifests in society now. And I think anti-Semitism is really different than some of the oppressions and privileges the progressives are really focused on. When you talk about systemic racism or misogyny, they understand those, they understand how they function, they understand the academic research. And with anti-Semitism, there's a huge understanding gap. And one of the things I like to tell people is anti-Semitism functions more like a conspiracy theory and less like the type of analysis you may be used to reading. So it takes some time to really, as Manny was saying, get used to understanding the tropes and get used to understanding what you're hearing and understanding the historical context and weight of that to then be able to even identify what's happening. And unfortunately, that education isn't just not happening on the left, it's broadly not happening on American society. But I'm supposed to be moderating, so let me turn it over to Alex.
Yeah, I will say, my for the audience's background, I know that the panelists know this. I was born in the Soviet Union. My father was an Ukaznik in the Soviet Union, a refusenik, and facing the repression of formal and informal from the Soviet government because he was a Jew. That was generations of my family experiencing that both in the Soviet Union and in the Russian Empire. With respect to Soviet policy on this, I think that a lot of Russian Jews, and we have the Philadelphia community. I know there's a lot of Jews in North Philly who speak Russian. That there will be a lot of people who have that kind of background who I think our starting point, or at least my starting point, I don't want to speak for everyone else, is to be very attuned to anti-Semitism from the left. It was a socialist government that, on the grounds of creating a workers' paradise, on the grounds of being inclusive, of creating an egalitarian society, that systematically discriminated against and persecuted Jews. And a lot of the rhetoric that is employed both in America and around the world by people who are quote unquote on the left is very familiar to Soviet Jewish ears because the Soviet government created it and promoted it around the world in advance of their foreign policy in the Middle East. And there are a lot of things that, we'll get into it later on the distinction between, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and everything else. But a lot of these policies that they called anti-Zionist, they used to persecute their own Jewish citizens. And so there's a special kind of sensitivity to give the example from the Women's March of Linda Sarsour going out and making as a precondition for participating in the march that you cannot be a Zionist, which is an interesting precondition to make, and one that inspires a lot of worry for a lot of people of my kind of background. When you have BLM rallies, most of which were nonviolent, most of which were peaceful, most of which had nothing to discuss with anti-Semitism, but at one, there was a synagogue being vandalized that made the rounds through Russian WhatsApp groups immediately of here's these leftists attacking Jewish institutions. There's a kind of sensitivity that's just built in automatically that I think is not necessarily the starting point for most American Jews, but to just see it of people who call themselves the left, people who talk about equality, and people who don't like Jews or Israel is a very familiar kind of thing. The struggle that we have is that, I'm not personally equipped to be at the starting point understanding of anti-Semitism that doesn't look like that, or anti-Semitism where they talk like that, but they don't win elected office. Linda Sarsour is not going to be winning any elected office in Brooklyn or anywhere else. These people are not using the powers of the state to be denying me employment, to be denying me the ability to travel to Israel, to be denying me the ability to express my beliefs, or denying me the ability to practice my religion, all of which were things that the Soviet government did. So it's important to be vigilant about these kinds of things, but also to understand the scale of the threat that we are talking about with respect to them as well.
I think that makes sense. And I think we should talk a little bit about, why it's important to be holding people accountable within our own political homes, within the political movements we're generally in and comfortable with, and what some of the ways we begin to have those conversations are. What are effective ways of having those conversations, and, what is the importance of having those, particularly in the places that are within our sphere of influence?
I can try to start to kind of to chip away at that big question there, Carly. One thing that I think the important thing about holding our own folks accountable is, I think about where I got started in marriage equality. So long before, many, many moons ago, right? I was a young gay kid in rural Minnesota who just wanted to get married someday. And I was on a college campus, and we were in Ruby Red, Minnesota, and we had to have conversations with my friends of why they needed to get out to vote, right? My friends weren't necessarily gay. They weren't, but their vote mattered to make sure that the Constitution in Minnesota didn't define marriage between a man and woman that would affect my life, right? And it was having that conversation where in 2012, Minnesota became the first state in the country to overturn an amendment at the ballot to define marriage between a man and a woman, right? Now let's fast forward to where we are around anti-Semitism, right? In our spheres of influence, or any type of oppression, right? Racism. If just because it doesn't affect you personally, directly, doesn't mean that it doesn't affect someone that you love or that you could care about. And I think, you hear so often, are Jews the canary in the coal mine, right? And I would argue in other communities, there are other canaries in the coal mine. And what's the real, predator we're fighting? It's oppression, right? And having to have that understanding is really, really important. So I'm going to pitch it off to Alex kind of with that mindset and see if you have more to add.
Yeah, I think, for me, I live in New York. I am in very much the progressive bubble. I deal with a lot of people who are active in progressive politics locally in the city itself and on, the national scale, just because a lot of national media is here. The consumption of it is like a normal thing, and the discussion points here are all of it. My experience when talking to Gentiles about this is that most of them are well-meaning people, but they don't consume the same media that Jews do. I don't want to be knocking the Forward where I write, but they're not reading it. They're not reading Tablet. They're not reading JTA. They're not reading any of the Israeli publications. They have no sense of the ecosystem of this. When I talk about acts of anti-Semitic violence in New York, the only time that they hear it is when I am bringing it up. They're in a different ecosystem than I am in, right? They're not on the WhatsApp groups getting all of the news. They are not seeing the latest statements from the ADL or the local federations. It's just not the world that they occupy. And so coming at it, I've watched this both in real time at rallies and interpersonally in a lot of kinds of local things of Jews come in with the attitude of, we are all working with the same information and you don't care about it. Just think about it as if you're on the receiving end of it. And I brought this up to, a lot of Jews over the course of the years here of up until very recently, nobody was aware of the extent of violence against Asian Americans in New York. I'm not even talking about anywhere else in the country, just in New York specifically, that there was a very large amount of violence targeting Asian Americans, and it went up dramatically during COVID, courtesy of our former president. And nobody who was in the Jewish world was aware of it because they weren't in that ecosystem. That's not to say that they don't care or that they're progressive except for issues for Asian Americans. It's just that they didn't know about it. That is a natural thing when you're a minority. The issue that is most important to you may not even be on somebody's list of priorities because they don't know about it. And so to come with that kind of understanding of not everybody's hostile, not everybody's out to get you, they just don't know, be their source of information, be a resource for them, be a person who's willing to engage with them and not immediately tell them you're a raging Jew hater and you hate Israel and you hate Jews and you want us all to die. That's not a way to be changing minds. That's not a way to be engaging people. Most people are not that hostile. I've had a lot of interactions where I was afraid that on the other side of it, I'm going to encounter somebody who hardcore has, drank the Kool-Aid on a lot of things that are very important to me. And in the discussion where I share information with them, a lot of the times the response I get is, oh my God, that's terrible. I had no idea. These are people who later joined for, Jewish rallies in the city. These are people who have called up their members of Congress afterwards. It's just the nature of politics and the nature of socializing in general, of be a human being to other people and you'll be pleasantly surprised that they can be too.
I think you brought up a couple of really important points there. One, just a point of clarification as we talk about waves of violence against Asian Americans. The ADL that I'm really proud to be a part of has been pushing legislation and has been able to, in that, build new relationships, new bonds, strengthen and deepen existing ones. Yeah, but I think one of the things that you brought up, Alex, it's really important to talk about is the stratification of our media. So I'll talk to people all the time and they'll be like, I don't think African Americans ever care about anti-Semitism. And I'll be like, but did you read that article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or in the Root, or did you read what Jamel Hill wrote about it in the Atlantic? And they'll be like, well, I don't read those writers. And I'll be like, well, okay, so that's a problem too. Some of the sort of stratification of the voices you're hearing. And that's why this coalition work is so important. Being out in community with people, showing up for the things they care about, not in a transactional way, but in a relationship building way. In my career, I've seen is really the only way to really build long lasting movements against anti-Semitism with new partners. Manny.
Yeah, I want to bounce off of real quick if I can. What Alex is also hitting on this last point of, as a non-Jew, I remember feeling like I couldn't necessarily always ask questions as I wanted to learn about let's talk about some hot topic issues, right? When I wanted to learn about what is Zionism, I couldn't define Zionism, honestly, probably till even maybe a year ago. And I used to work at APAC, right? I was the Progressive Outreach Director, and I was like, I still don't know how to define these things. And so I had to ask really hard questions, and having those safe spaces as a non-Jew and trying to go to programming where it's not, the program is geared towards a Jewish audience is very uncomfortable for me. It's important to realize that also as an ally, right, we often have to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations. I know for a fact that tonight I have friends who are watching this, who are not Jewish, who I've had very hard conversations with. They're like, we just need to learn more. And I was like, you have to start showing up and being comfortable. So there's one thing there that I wanted to kind of like nudge on, is that we have to create those spaces. But also, I know we're talking a lot about the ADL, which is a national organization that, yes, has regional offices. But I want to also remind folks that we have dozens of JCRCs who have come on board to promote this, who are doing the work with us in tandem in the regions. And I will tell you, as a non-Jew who has kind of come into this space, it was the Minnesota JCRC who was the first organization that reached out and said, hey, you're talking about anti-Semitism in Minnesota with some fairly prominent elected officials. Let's talk to us. We want to, what resources do you need? And they've become very good friends of mine over the years now. So I just kind of want to bring that into the conversation of how do we, as the left, right, like coming from far left progressive organizing grassroots movements, start to understand outside of my own community, outside of the Native community, outside of the LGBTQ community, which we already also know, right? There are LGBTQ Jews, there are Native Jews, but I think that's a really great insight that we have to acknowledge when we look at how do we combat and build on the left.
I think that's right. I love what you said about creating safe spaces, and it really reflects sort of where I have landed at various points in my career with colleagues, people I care about coming to me and asking questions with really loaded language that even times the language themselves they used was fairly anti-Semitic, but they came to me really wanting to understand, coming from spaces of saying, I've been asked to sign on to a letter saying anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism and, all the horrible sort of buzzwords you can throw out there about Israel. But I know you don't think that way, and we've rallied together and worked together and passed bills together. Can you give me your version of it? So I think it really comes down to relationships, to trust building, to showing up for other communities in terms of, both what we see as what a lot of Jews, at least if you look at the polling, overwhelmingly align on those values. And also, it's good strategy. It's good relationship building. I want to, since we've been talking a little bit about, how people got here, I think it's a good moment just to give Manny and Alex a moment to talk a little bit more about themselves. Manny, do you want to just answer sort of the big question, like, how did you end up here? Like, if you look at the polling, you probably wouldn't end up in an organization focused on anti-Semitism. How did this become sort of a number one life issue for you as a young Indigenous gay progressive in the Midwest?
Yeah. So for folks who don't know, I'm an enrolled member of Fond du Lac Band of the Lake Superior Chippewa as a Native American. I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, which is a small town of 80,000 on the tip of Lake Superior, graduating high school in 2012. And I was a musical theater major. I was going to dance and sing my way through life. And now I often just dance and sing in my bedroom. It's, you get what you get. Fast forward, working on marriage equality, in 2013, when Minnesota finally passed it and we signed, and the governor, Mark Dayton, signed that bill, I looked out into a sea of tens of thousands of Minnesotans waving pride flags, waving flags that said united in love. And it was that first spark that I said, wow, this movement that we built can change the world. People showed up for us. Like, there's no way in the world that everyone in that sea of tens of thousands were gay, but they heard our stories and they fought for us. And that kind of message has kind of propelled me through working in a lot of Democratic campaigns, sitting on the state executive committee of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, and working on the Clinton campaign in 2016. What happened in 2016, election aside, was this wake up moment on the left. And it started with a conversation with you, Carly, right? Of around anti-Semitism on the left and me not being able to answer it, and that challenge to myself of, okay, my friend who, quite honestly, her Jewishness never really meant anything to me. Once she mentioned her mother was a rabbi, and it didn't even click in my head that it meant she was Jewish, right? Yeah, please don't tell your mom that. But Carly, I asked you to send me every single article that would ever come up around anti-Semitism for like a month. I was like, if there's an article about a JCC, a Jewish community center, or a synagogue, like that's not, as Alex said earlier, was not coming through my media consumption. And I asked you, I was like, let me learn, like, let me just read it and just like realize how big of a threat anti-Semitism really is. This was 5 years ago. As we know, we've seen anti-Semitism consistently rise year after year, or reported anti-Semitic incidents have continued to rise. And that's for a myriad of reasons, but it also means that anti-Semitism is obviously here and we have to confront it. And realizing, Carly, you've shown up for my community in ways that I probably will never know. But we had a friendship. And then fast forward to October, I believe, 2018. And I'm sorry if the dates are off. During Shabbat services, a man walked in and killed a lot of people. I think 12 people at Tree of Life Synagogue. Sorry, it's just escaping me. And I was on a date in Minneapolis, and I know that the Philly community knows this very well. In Pittsburgh, I was on a date in Minneapolis, and my boyfriend's phone went off, and he checked it because it was work, and he said, "Oh my God, there's a shooting at a synagogue." And all I could hear in my voice was a dear friend saying, "Nobody outside of the Jewish community is really going to take anti-Semitism seriously until there's blood in the streets." And I immediately started calling you, Carly, and I couldn't get a hold of you all day, and rightfully so, right? Like, this is, first off, it's Shabbat. There's all these things happening. Yeah. But when we finally had a conversation, we cried for an hour. And I didn't know what else to say to you other than the fact that I know that when a tragedy happens, people show up tomorrow. They'll show up maybe the day after tomorrow, maybe even a week. But in a year, are they there? Are they really fighting to understand what catalyzed, this huge tragedy? And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I promised that I wouldn't be that friend that would just show up tomorrow. And it's holding myself to that standard. So from that, I actually saw on Twitter, I went and followed everybody with the handle Rabbi on Twitter, because I wanted to learn about anti-Semitism, and where else as a millennial do I learn about anti-Semitism but online? And that meant me connecting with a rabbi connected with Chabad, talking about a string of anti-Semitic incidents in Crown Heights against the Orthodox community there. And I said, hey, I have friends who are elected officials in New York because of the DNC. Like, I will make a phone call. I will do whatever. Like, I want to learn. And he was like, you should come to my Shabbat dinner sometime. And I was like, I've never been to New York.
Yeah.
And, we went on Jewish Twitter, and Carly was like, man, he's going to New York. Everybody, tell him where the best bagel is. And then I got invited to stay with a family in Flatbush, Barbara and Avishai, who said, if you want to learn, like, come have Shabbos with us. And it was that moment. And it was building those key relationships that I never would have had. And it started with that. So that's kind of what motivates me every single day. And obviously I've worked, at APAC and now the EDL. But it's that community organizing, understanding that if we're going to combat anti-Semitism, we have to center the voices of the community most directly impacted. And that is obviously the Jewish community. So that's kind of what I do and how I came here.
Yeah, I think it's a really instructive story about what is possible and the friends we can make and the achievements we can have when we keep our doors open, when we try to build new relationships, when we try to stay in conversation with people. Alex, you wrote a really fascinating article about a year and a half ago. I think I've sent it to everyone I know, just about like what led you to care about the Black Lives Matter movement and to care about it particularly like as someone who came here as a refugee, who came here from the Soviet Union, and the sort of change you saw happening as people in our community were really leaning into that movement. Do you want to talk a little bit about that experience?
Sure. So the BLM was kind of like an interesting moment for me for folks who are unfamiliar. As I mentioned before, most refugees from the Soviet Union, wherever they landed, be it in America, Germany, Israel, Australia, tend to be fairly right-wing in their politics. And that was the starting point for me as well. My drift to the left was a fairly gradual one over a period of years, actually very much intertwined with becoming more observant and, moving to New York and everything. But it was a very alienating thing of things that came to be important issues for me, whether it was gay marriage, reproductive rights, universal health care, those kinds of things. Of the response from family and friends was very often on, this is a bunch of Bolshevik nonsense. Like, why do you care about any of this? And I saw like a lot of that during BLM as well. There was like a very prominent thing going around, like the forward kinds of emails of our kids are becoming Bolsheviks, which is to say that the children of Russian Jewish refugees were showing up for BLM. And I had friends who I'd never seen involved in politics who were marching at BLM things. And just a kind of mini civil war broke out between the American-raised children and the Russian native parents on this thing of like, can't you see that this is the same thing that we fled? And the kids saying like, can't you see that the persecution that you were denied is also being experienced here as well? Let me rephrase that. I mean, in the Soviet Union, they denied that there was any kinds of persecution of Jews. Everybody talked about how it's full equality, and Jews could see in their daily lives that that was not the case. That if you had the fifth line on your documents documenting you as a Jew, that you were denied employment opportunities, that you were denied educational opportunities, that there were certain, entire swaths of occupations. If you know any Russian Jews who are computer programmers, that's a reflection of systemic discrimination of entire professions were denied to us. And a lot of interpersonal violence of it, of a lot of people of my parents' generation, their experience of going to school was the first day of school, they would be singled out, told to stand up, and the class would know that that kid is a Jew. That was an incitement to violence, and a lot of them experienced that kind of violence interpersonally. So there's a deep weariness of it. And so to have, your kids who are suddenly on the other side of this saying that we are marching in favor of racial equality, we are marching in favor of, abolishing systemic kinds of forms of discrimination, whether it's in policing or the justice system or in employment and wherever else, you can reasonably reach the conclusion on both sides. A lot, I won't say all, a lot of younger Russian-speaking Jews went on the side of, I know this story, I know this struggle, this is my family's struggle, and that's why they participated in it. And it was a very interesting kind of moment. I had, a lot of responses from all over the country, Russian-speaking Jews in Minnesota, in LA, in Atlanta. I didn't even know that there were Russian Jews in Atlanta. Reaching out of, I'm having this struggle with my family right now. And I tried to document a lot of these kinds of responses and everything. And I think it was kind of a moment of introspection of, what is the thing that we are fighting for or against here? That for me, looking at what was happening here, of course, people who have marched under the banner of, the Movement for Black Lives have written stuff about Israel that I disagree with. But when I talked to two people in New York who were showing up for BLM rallies, which includes my fiance, by the way, and a lot of other people, Jewish and not Jewish, of Israel never comes up in the conversation. They have no idea what these statements are. They were marching because they were dissatisfied with policing in New York specifically. It's not even on the radar. And, this whole kind of broad swath brush of everybody who shows up for this hates Jews, to me was just a complete disconnect from reality. It was a very disappointing thing of watching older Russian Jews in print say that BLM is comparable to the Bolsheviks when in the streets of New York, police were showing up without their uniforms in unmarked cars and taking people off the streets. There is something here that reminds me of the Soviet Union. It's obviously not the same thing and for a lot of different reasons, but it's not quite the thing that they are describing. And so it was a struggle moment of, this is a heated conversation, not just in print, not just in media, not somewhere else, but over the dinner table of we are disagreeing at home, and how do we navigate that disagreement?
And I'm really glad you bring all of that up, because I think it hits on some of the key tensions, and that one of the big tensions we're talking about, and I can see in the chat, are tensions around Israel. Some of that is, tensions around rhetoric, what rhetoric is acceptable when, what is the line of criticism that is acceptable, but also open hostility, open anti-Zionism, and real cruelty that we can all believe and agree crosses the line into anti-Semitism across the left. So there's a couple of different set of questions and things to unpack here. One, what do you think is going on? Two, so how common and frequent of occurrence is it? And how much is it influencing leadership level and influencing policy? And I'll stop there because we can go on and we will talk about Israel more, but I'll pause there.
I mean, for me, first off, I would say when often we're talking about voices of dissent is what I refer to them as, right? Some people would call them the squad that would go against leadership. Let's talk about the huge win that we just had in the US House of passing Iron Dome funding. There was huge rhetoric that came from certain members of Congress that were trying to misportray what the Iron Dome is, what it does, and how the U.S. support for Israel, what it does and what it means. That being said, that's a huge conversation. We can translate that to what I think we're seeing on college campuses, within, what we'd argue like the racial justice movement. And yes, there are loud voices. There are very loud voices that are saying things from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free or will be free. I don't even know how the phrase goes because it's not what I do. That being said, we know, these are the voices that we hear, but we also focus on. And what I think is, it's been interesting for me to follow and to watch in my journey is, why is that the voice that folks who want to fight anti-Semitism want to focus on by immediately demonizing, condemning? We have to call it anti-Semitism, but the amount of energy that is put to completely shut down an individual, as opposed to looking at the sphere of influence around that and being like, look, sure, they're a leader or they're shouting something and everyone else is following, but what is the real reason that other people are marching? Similar to what Alex was saying, they were marching for racial justice. They weren't marching about Israel or Palestine or even the conflict. So why are we not seeing laser focused on the root issue of what catalyzed people to come together, right? Reach out on that end and saying, hey, we support this because it's such a, there's one person or maybe 5 people out of 100, or we'll say whatever the percentage is, it's not that high to the people who are marching for racial justice. I get very wary about how often we want to put up a bad voice on a pedestal, for lack of a better phrase. If you know what I'm saying, I was marching with people who were saying from the river to the sea. And I know that I still do it today, right? But if anybody wants to combat anti-Semitism, you don't necessarily want to go after the person who you ardently disagree with. You want to go to people who are like, hey, do you understand this? Do you understand why the statements that are also happening? And is it also a distraction from the real goal that we're trying to accomplish, which is liberation? We're trying to make sure that we have safe communities here in the United States, right? We're trying to make sure that, communities of color have safety. And is this a distraction? And are we losing momentum? It's something I would raise into that first question, Carly.
Yeah, I would add to that I think I have the instinct for the same tactics as Manny, but I do think, when we talk about the coalition politics of America, I think of Jews as a group with their own interests and their own policy objectives that are part of that coalition. And if there are people who would assign preconditions to our participation into the coalition, who would normalize rhetoric of, referring to Israel as baby killers, a thing that a Democratic member of Congress said on the House floor. And then coincidentally, that same week, I was walking on the Upper West Side wearing a kippah, and I had some teenagers chase me down the street yelling baby killer. It's an interesting, coincidence that they happen around the same time, that it is a worthwhile thing that some people who you will work with on some issues, that you recognize that on the topic of Jewish safety in America, I'm not talking about people saying nice things about Israel, but I'm talking about our safety here as American citizens, that it is a worthwhile thing to be partnering with other parts of the coalition to marginalize those kinds of voices. That includes on, members of Congress who I personally am not very happy with. I've been frankly disappointed with a number of them. I had high hopes and have been disappointed in the last couple of years seeing how they respond to anti-Semitism in the United States. That it is a worthwhile thing to be having that fight. I'm grateful that organizations like the ADL exist and the federations as well to be pushing back on this and to be saying that, no, it's actually not acceptable to call people baby killers. It's actually not acceptable to say that a precondition to participation is opposing Zionism when 90% of American Jews are Zionist, pro-Israel, whatever you want to be calling it, have an affinity for the Jewish state. That this is the politics of our community, and we are members of this coalition too. There are ways to be doing it. There are different kinds of channels and tactics and everything else, but these are worthwhile disagreements to be having publicly and privately that ensure our place and also ensure that when the government is carrying out policy, that it does policy that benefits our community. To give a local example in New York of, there's a lot of quote unquote anti-Israel voices in the city of New York, but also at the same time, the politics of the city are, in terms of people who hold office and who decide policy and allocate resources, is wildly favorable towards the Jewish community. The new governor of New York just recently announced additional funding for security measures for the Jewish community. It's worth talking about why we need those security measures, but it's also a positive thing that we have a government that is very favorable and responsive to those kinds of needs. That it's a worthwhile thing to be doing, and understanding of our engagement with us showing up and us fighting for the things that are important for us does deliver results as well.
So I think if I had to sum up what we're talking about at the moment in 3 words, it's relationships, solidarity, education, and then lastly, accountability. No one on this panel is saying when members of Congress who are on the left say anti-Semitic things, we should all pretend it didn't happen. No one here is saying that. I agree that I think there's some conversation about, who gets to focus and when, and how do we make sure we aren't giving people more power than they functionally have in Congress by elevating them. But beyond that, it does seem like we're coalescing around a framework of relationship building, deep engagement, particularly early on in people's lives and careers, education and accountability.
Carly, I want to address something that I think is really important from the way that I approach addressing anti-Semitism on the left. It's the intergenerational trauma that I believe the Jewish community feels. As a Native American, intergenerational trauma for me is something that I understand full-heartedly. And I think one thing that is really worrying, and especially for me as someone who cares deeply about long-term success of the left and of progressive values, because I believe we have so much to fix in the world, is how do we do that and accomplish our work when, in a way that doesn't trigger folks, right? No way that's gonna be triggering, because politics is personal, right? Our wins are personal, and the experiences of oppression get personal, they're triggering. I think that's a really important thing that we just have to acknowledge, right? That when we see anti-Semitism on campus, right, that college students are facing, that the intergenerational trauma of understanding like why do Jews have these instinctual reactions and why they feel, is not something that the vast majority of college students understand, let alone society. We don't talk about trauma in a trauma-informed response, let alone talk about how we use it as an organizing model to make sure that we don't burn out. That's a failure that we have on the left, right? It's a failure I would say we have in overall organizational politics. But I think it's a thing that I just want to bring into the conversation, because I see so many passionate voices from the community that are really trying to address pain, right? Of feeling as if our friends aren't showing up for us, or the people who said they espouse our values have drawn a line on a value that is so personal to you, right? Zionism, making sure that Israel has the right to exist in her most full self without being attacked. And that's a personal thing. I think it's really important that folks who aren't Jewish understand and that emotional reaction.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about there is humanization, right? It's something that comes up in a lot of different contexts. Israel, I think, is a really key one. Anti-Semitism more broadly, I think, is really clear. Certainly anti-Zionism. Really just, the more you are a part of communities, know people, etc., the harder it is to see you and your viewpoint and your liberation as disposable. Not always, we don't live in a perfect world, but when these conversations are happening offline in particular, I think, yeah, we're talking about humanization. So I know we've talked through a lot. Before I go to questions, I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity. Is there anything we haven't touched on before I go into questions? If there's anything, left you'd like to really just talk about before I turn it over to questions and start asking you some questions from the chat.
I do. I want to talk about how we often fail to realize that we win these fights. So, Carly, you talked about the members of the Women's March who clashed with the Jewish community. Manny, you talked about members of Congress. In these kinds of fights that we have, the Women's March eventually accommodated a lot of the feedback from the Jewish community. Some of the most notorious members are no longer formally affiliated with it, and it cost them influence both in New York and around the country to be picking the fights that they were picking. The members of Congress who were recently picking a fight over the Iron Dome, well, they asked for a standalone bill. They got a standalone bill. The majority of Democrats and Republicans voted for it. That we can get frustrated that people are even pushing back on these kinds of things, but it's also worth knowing that on the policy goals that we have and on the leadership that we would like to be seeing, that when we pick these fights, we often win. And I think it is an important thing to, I think there's always a feeling of siege with these kinds of things of, I'm really disappointed these people are on my side. Why are they constantly attacking me? Why are we always talking about Israel when there's, a million other issues that we could be doing? Why isn't anybody talking about the things that are important to me? That when we pick these fights, and especially in policy-oriented spaces, we win, and it matters that we win. It's not just it's a nice pat on the back. It's time to go back into the trenches. It's important to recognize that we have influence, we have agency in this process, and we should be celebrating that.
I want to circle back to that, but I also want to give Manny just the opportunity to add, are there things we haven't touched on before I start going into Q&A that you just want to have a chance to bring up?
I don't think so. I think that, the big thing that I just always try to articulate is, I guess what drives me every single day to do this work is, on the left, Jews are a vital part of this movement. And I don't think there's often said that that's important, right? That the history of American Jews specifically, right, where let's talk domestic, I don't want to go global, it's not my area of expertise, have consistently shown up. Whether it was when I was, at Standing Rock and I had a rabbi take a water cannon in front of me instead of me getting hit as a Native person, right? Or it was, during the occupation of Alcatraz, where a rabbi brought a menorah and rode across the bay and brought food and water to folks, Native Americans fighting for our own liberation. That being said, how are folks showing up today in these spaces? And how are we also all, and I just mean this with Jews, but natives and other communities, showing up authentically with ourselves and making sure that centering that our identities and our individualness is what motivates us to show up together. And I think that's a big thing that we have to do on the left. So we'll go to questions from there, but that was one thing I just want to make sure we hit.
So 2 questions that come up right away. First, we've talked about the scope of the problem, where it's bubbling up, where it's influential, and where it's not, where it's at the margins and where it isn't. But one question that comes up that I think is really worth addressing is, even if the problem is limited in scale, how do we limit its impact? How do we keep it from growing? We may be winning the Iron Dome vote now by, I believe it was 492 to 6. Don't quote me on it. Over, 492 to 6 or 4, I can't remember, sorry. But how do we make sure that in the next round, that's not 20 or 40? How do we limit the impact and keep it from growing? Alex, do you want to start?
I can start. Very candidly, I think that there is an illusion of control that we do in a lot of portions of our lives, that we think that we have everything under control. We think that we can control the outcomes of everything. And then when things don't go our way, we, pack up and go home. I don't think that there's any surefire method of this is the thing that will stop that coalition from growing. But I do think that the attitude of, well, somebody here I disagree with, therefore I'm taking my toys and going home, is not a productive way of engaging with this. If you want to be winning these arguments, whether it's in activist spaces or on Capitol Hill or in the media, you have to be showing up, you have to be engaging thoughtfully and strategically with what you are doing, not just coming in, we're going to go storm the castle here, that you have to put in the work. It's like with anything else in life. If you want to do the things, you have to put in the effort to make it happen. And I think it's kind of a daunting thing to say of like, I've got a life, I've got, bills to pay, I've got work to do, whatever else. If this thing is important to you, you will prioritize it, because I promise you the people you disagree with are prioritizing it.
Manny, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I just really would echo what Alex is saying here, but also you don't have to be high in the sky and looking at necessarily the big tall trees, right? Look at the little grass around you, right? How can you personally impact and grow something, right? I as an organizer, I always tell myself whenever I apply for a job, and I'm not an organizer now, right? I'm an assistant regional director doing operations for the ADL. But I always say, my job is to organize myself out of a job. And if you care about anti-Semitism, you're seeing a few people that you don't feel as if you could have a direct impact. I would venture a guess that there are 3 people very close to you who probably don't know that you can grow your own sphere of influence, right? You can grow your own movement. And I would never underestimate the power of reaching out and doing that, and being really frank with the folks that care for you, even if they don't understand the issues.
I agree with that, and I think I've seen it in my own world, just like talking to people about the issues that my community cares about, talking about anti-Semitism, talking about rising hate crimes, etc., and really pushing those conversations. And I think we are seeing more on the congressional level, on the activist level, an interest to learn. That's been my experience. And I think early engagement is key, especially with people who are interested in running for things.
And consistent, right? Don't just show up once. You have to continue to show up and build those relationships. So consistency and early on is definitely a key.
I had a great conversation with an activist named Charlotte Clymer. She's one of the most prominent trans rights activists in the country, who's involved herself in anti-Semitism issues and wanting to be a good ally to the Jewish community. And I said, how did you get involved in this? She said, I didn't grow up knowing any Jewish people. I grew up in a trailer park in Texas. I never met a Jew until I moved to Washington. But I went to a lot of trans things and rallies and LGBTQ rallies, and the Jewish community was always there. And over time, I got to make a lot of friends. And then they started having rallies, and I thought, well, of course I'll go to those. And of course, I want to learn about the issues and understand them. Even if we don't agree on every point ever politically, I want to understand what's happening and I want to be supportive. So yeah, I think it's about engagement and relationship building. Another question that is coming up sort of broadly and bubbling up a couple different sort of questions and places is what is happening, with campus anti-Semitism, how particularly that coming out of progressive movements, how we're hearing so many stories of Jewish Americans not feeling safe, people feeling angry about how their kids are being treated by professors, by students, by student organizations, by administrations, and it's a big problem, and the infrastructure and the viewpoints on different campuses and the issues on different campuses in some ways are different, and in some ways there's obvious trends. But one of the things we're being asked repeatedly right now is, why is that happening? How do we start to combat it? What can we do to make the college experience a safer one, a better one, and really address some of the anti-Semitism there? And what is does anti-Semitism on campus have longer term ramifications for American Jews? Alex, do you want to start?
Sure. So I've been out of college for almost a decade at this point. So, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I'm going to speak to my experience on a college campus, Rutgers University, where the local pro-Palestinian groups were very active during my time in college. Notable things include of holding fundraisers, which were later the funds were frozen and investigated by the Department of Education because they were fundraising for groups tied with Hamas. The same events where they denied visibly Jewish students entry to a student-funded event on a campus where folks marched saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, a place where they were harassing Jewish students in the dorms. I think I experienced the thick of it of, I don't really think the problems have changed that dramatically in the last 10 years. They're functionally the same ones that I had when I was there. And I was unknowingly falling into the thick of it. I was the Israel chair at my Hillel, doing all the fun Israel advocacy kinds of things that one does in college, and experiencing the brunt of this behavior. And the kinds of conversations that I think were happening at the time, where a lot of it was, it's ostensibly BDS, that they are doing this because they want to be targeting the Israeli government. They want to be punishing policies of the Israeli government with respect to the occupation or to, the settlement enterprise. It's a very interesting thing of advancing that policy agenda by harassing Jewish students on campus. And that's functionally the only thing that they were accomplishing. I think it's worth, talking about the successes and failures of BDS. BDS was launched in 2005. Since that time, the Israeli GDP has doubled. There are more countries with diplomatic relations with Israel. They're more integrated into the global economy than they were at that point. It is a much wealthier country and more powerful country than it was at that time. Of the key successes of BDS is harassing Jewish students on campus. And I think it's worthwhile to be talking about what we are really dealing with here of when you are going through and saying ostensibly this is a criticism of the Israeli government of, well, then go to the local Israeli consulate. There's a bunch of them all around the country. Feel free to protest in front of them. Go talk to your member of Congress about what you want to do. When they start targeting Jewish institutions like Hillel or local Chabads or whatever else, or targeting Jewish students directly, we're not talking about a criticism of Israel. We are talking about anti-Semitism. You are targeting those people and those institutions because they are Jewish. Now, they dress it up sometimes of they promote birthright and whatever else. There's no other conceivable kinds of community where you would say, well, this Mexican student organization promotes Mexican culture, therefore we're going to go harass them because we're dissatisfied with the policies of the Mexican government in the drug war. Or comparably of Chinese student associations of, we are horrified by what the Chinese government is doing with the Uyghurs, therefore we're going to go harass Chinese students. We understand on the face of it that that is just a blatantly prejudiced kind of thing to do, but we're a little bit more circumstanced. There's a lot of debate within the Jewish community of how to be responding to these kinds of things. And my response on it is always of state very clearly what the problem is. I don't really care how they feel about Israel. I care that they are harassing Jewish students. That is the distinction there. This is not an acceptable political expression. It's not acceptable to be targeting communal life associations. It's not acceptable to be saying that Jewish students are not legitimate parts of campus, which was a notable thing at a college in California a couple of years ago, of whether Jews could be on the student boards because of the fact that they were Jews or they had an affinity for Israel. You were setting preconditions to Jewish participation in campus life. This is discrimination. And it's a disturbing thing if people walk out of college and into the real world where they start getting involved in substantive political activism, where they may run for office themselves, where they may become, civil bureaucrats setting policy in various ways and not have those ideas challenged. It's a worthwhile thing to be doing. I don't think that we've had the strongest response to this, partly because this comes in waves, right? Especially when there is, a conflict happening between Israel and the Palestinians, where there is a spectacle in the news that people are responding to, emotions run very high. Those are the moments where we tend to be mobilizing. The slower days of it tends to be a lot quieter, in terms of the work that you have to be doing. You have to keep showing up. You have to be pressing the campus administrations on this. You have to be, if it's a state-funded university, of talking with the local government about this. And there are Jewish organizations that do these kinds of things. But very often we get mired into the debate of, well, we're policing criticism of Israel, right? What's a legitimate expression of criticism of Israel? And to my mind, you can criticize the policies of the Israeli government however you want, but once you are targeting Jewish students and not, the local Israeli consulate for your actions, we are not talking about a criticism of Israel. And so you have to be very targeted in that and very persistent in showing up and saying, this is an unacceptable form of discrimination is what we're talking about here, and harassment. This is not advocacy for any kind of policy agenda. And pushing the administrations on this and pushing, if you are a donor to these universities, I have personally called up my alma mater and told them why I won't be donating anymore after they walk back a condemnation of anti-Semitism. Of people have to be understanding that there are consequences for your actions and there are consequences for inaction as well.
Yeah, and I totally agree with everything you're saying, Alex. I think as we talk about this framework that is relationship building, education, we can't forget about the accountability side of it. And if universities that are allowing that type of behavior need to be held accountable. And I think a lot of us are exploring the most effective ways to do that. But certainly students, those paying the bills of students, and major donors have a lot more power there than they may realize. Absolutely, I completely agree with you. Another question that's come in a couple different ways that I think is worth sort of exploring is this sort of idea that, I've been supportive of other communities, and during recent Israeli-Palestinian conflict, during, when we saw this huge wave of attacks against Israel, against Israeli civilians, they were totally silent or in total disagreement with me. And I don't know why I should continue to engage at all, or how to unpack that emotionally or politically. Manny, do you want to weigh in?
Well, first off, let me say this. We are not perfect as a movement, right? And I think we've said that a few times, but I think it's really important to nail that home. And that being said, it is so important that what was just read by the folks who were commenting of I felt as if I wasn't, why are they on this side? Why are they so on the opposite side of me on this issue is acknowledged. I think to get to the heart of this is, how do we message, right? And how do we break through a lot of things? This last escalation in May, I posted on my personal Facebook page that I stand with Israel. When hundreds of rockets were being poured down on innocent Israeli civilians indiscriminately, I posted, I stand with Israel, right? Didn't actually mitigate whether or not I believe in two states or not. And people immediately went off on my Facebook. Hundreds of comments, as it does. And I knew that walking into it. I know where my friends are at, or at least certain friends of mine, right? I used to be involved in the Minnesota Young Democrats when before Congresswoman Omar was Congresswoman Omar, she was in that committee with me, right? So I have friends who were like, oh, you believe in supporting apartheid, you believe in supporting X, Y, or Z. And I think what's really important, and it's not that it's an easy thing to do in these situations, is we've got to stick to the facts, right? We've got to own where we actually stand on Israel, on Israel's right to defend herself, right? And the ability for Palestinians and Israelis alike to live in peace, and to own that. In me wanting to defend Israel and have her right to defend herself from terrorist attacks, I also have to censure the fact that it is not just Israelis that are damaged when we have an escalation. And when I've done that, it has diffused a majority of folks who were like, oh, I thought that you were just gonna support, occupation, this, or this. And I'm like, look, actually, like, you weren't even trying to have that conversation. And then it also is reminding me that there's still, even though amongst the folks who were discouraging of support of Israel or around anti-Semitism, which we saw in America, and they correlated the anti-Semitism we saw domestically as critiques of Israel, that there are some folks who just also don't believe in nation states, right? That there's a very small minority of folks that use, just like we all use different movements for our own agenda, to propel theirs forward. And that's the issue here, right? How do we discern where we have somebody who completely would never be on the same page with us because our theory of change or their theory of government and all this other stuff is wrong, and they're going to use, inciting language, incitement against Jews as a cudgel to tear apart a movement? And then how do we discern that from people who just haven't been engaged before? And it's really about the nuance and just digging in deep, and also owning where we are as advocates for Israel or against anti-Semitism.
I will say, on my end of it, I think that engagement is good. To give an example of during the last escalation, there was a lot of weird stuff floating around on social media of just blatant falsehoods. We're not even talking about, is this a proportional response kinds of things, but things like Israel is fighting this conflict because of all of the oil in the Negev, and the Rothschilds bought the Negev to get all of the oil. Just like anti-Semitic nonsense kinds of things that were comfortably floating around in, progressive meme pages, all the BLM kinds of social media pages. Not all of them, I want to be more precise. Some of them were socializing these kinds of things. And my response on it during that time was, I will engage, interpersonally on this. I'm not picking fights with meme pages on this stuff. I've got other things to do with my life. My partner felt very differently about it. She had a lot of friends who were sharing this stuff, and she argued with them thoughtfully, not yelling, but really challenging on the things that you're promoting here are factually inaccurate, and they're anti-Semitic, and they're dangerous, and here's the reasons why. And she got a friend of hers to be taking down the things that he was distributing to, hundreds, if not thousands, of folks on social media. It is a thing that is possible. It's hard to do. It's stressful. I don't think it's fun in a lot of ways, but I will say that part of the reason why we have such bad criticism of Israel is because these groups love to trot out their token Jews of the Jewish community agrees with me. Here's this Jewish person who I brought along. There's no real model of what is good criticism of Israel and what is incitement against Jews and arguing against the existence of a Jewish state. Manny talks about people who, are against the nation state. In my experience, folks who are against the nation state, it's very curious that they always start with Israel as their example. There's a lot of nation states out in the world. Why is this one at the top of your list? And there are others who are involved in ethnic conflicts that are far bloodier than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? To be challenging those things in a lot of different kinds of ways. The thing that I would say on, what is worthwhile kinds of engagement is, can you be challenging this interpersonally? And also, can you model a better behavior for them? I have disagreements with the Israeli government, and it's not just about their conflict with the Palestinians. People can go read my writing. I'm very frustrated with how the rabbinate treats Russian Jews. Do I hate Israel because I publicly criticized the Israeli government? I'm going there for a wedding in December if they let me in. That there is
For
a
COVID
better way to
reasons,
be
not for
doing
his
this.
writing, to be clear. They let him in for COVID-related reasons.
Yeah,
Continue.
I'm not worried about the Israeli government stopping me. I doubt anyone reads my stuff there yet. But the way that we have this instinct, and I deal with this in a lot of different ways. Of a lot of Jews do not want to talk about dirty laundry in public.
Mm-hmm.
But when you do that, you cede that space to people who are not arguing in good faith, who are there to be tokens to people who hate us. That you have to model a better kind of behavior. So that means if there are policies that the government is pursuing that you are dissatisfied with, I want to be very specific here about specific kinds of policy choices that the government makes, not the existence or legitimacy of the government, that Jews can model the way to be doing this of. This is a progressive way to be challenging policies we disagree with. What I would recommend in those kinds of scenarios is specifically, to go back to the early example of my writing on the rabbinate of, I'm not going to be advocating for my member of Congress to be doing something about the rabbinate. That's functionally an internal affair of the Israeli government. But there are policy areas where America's interests diverge from the Israeli ones. And it's not because everybody hates each other or because there's a nefarious agenda, to be leaving Israel high and dry. It's because you see things differently. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a good example of that, of American interests and Israeli interests on this are not necessarily aligned. It's not in America's interest for Israel to be doing the policies that it does towards Palestinians with respect to undermining state formation, for example. There are a lot of things that you could be doing that Israel is not the only player here. Palestinian terrorism definitely plays a role in why the conflict is where it is. But there are constructive kinds of policies that Israel could be doing that it's not, that are in the interest of the United States of America. You can be advocating for those things. You can be advocating for them publicly and giving an alternative to people to say, this is the progressive response, not the Israel actually doesn't deserve to exist, folks.
I think that's a really strong argument. And a couple things I want to pick out. One of the things that we often end up saying at ADL is we'll get hit with this idea that anytime you criticize Israel, you get hit as being anti-Semitic. And how can you do that in a substantive policy way? And we argue, you can look to us. We're on record, both from our Israeli office and from other offices. One notable example would be the treatment of certain migrant groups. There are moments we've said, of course, we agree with Israel's right to exist. We support Israel. We're a Zionist organization. We're a pro-Israel organization. And just as we criticize the United States, at moments, we may have a policy disagreement. I think the more we push that framework within the left, the more it cuts out the true demagogue, those whose agendas really are extreme and beyond the pale. When the more we could say there's discourse here that is healthy, that is vibrant, as is Israeli democracy, where you really can have that debate. I think it really helps to cut out some of the legs under those really pushing extremism on the left. So, I think, we've touched on a lot here. I feel like we do have a couple sort of big set of framework ideas we're walking away with. Relationship building, deep engagement, accountability, and education about anti-Semitism, about Israel, about what it means to be Jewish, about who Jews are. And as we sort of look to the other side of this, this is a conversation particular to combating it on the left. I really look forward to seeing Bill Kristol's panel. I'll certainly be watching. I'll find it very interesting. But I think we can walk away from this with a couple big ideas about different tactics, different moments, and how we can begin to push the needle and build stronger, deeper relationships as we push back in the fight against anti-Semitism on the left. And the most important thing, of course, I think we can all agree, is to continue to speak out, whether that's publicly or privately, in your local media, with your member of Congress, with your friends, to continue to speak out, especially with those who you already know are in your sphere of influence, who already are in your political homeland, and help them to understand the issues. It's the most important thing I think we all can do on this, whether you're on the left or on the right. And with that, I want to turn it over to Danielle.
Oh, Danielle, I think
Danielle, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. The theme of, all of these Zoom opportunities. As I was saying, hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Weiss, and I am thrilled to be the chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Philadelphia. I appreciate so much that you all took the time to be here together tonight for this important conversation. Before we conclude our program this evening, I really want to thank our panelists, Manny and Alex, for sharing their truly personal stories with us. And thanks, of course, to our moderator, Carly, for facilitating this important discussion. Tonight's program demonstrates the imperative that we collectively combat the rise of anti-Semitism in our society and take it seriously. We have to call it out when we see it, and we have to condemn it, no matter where on the political spectrum it's coming from. It's up to us to speak out and to act whenever we hear anti-Jewish remarks. And I hope that all of you who attended this session tonight gained some skills and strategies for doing that. I also hope everyone who is here tonight will join us again for the next session, How Conservatives Can Counter Antisemitism on the Right, which is taking place on Monday, November 18th with Bill Crystal. The link to register can be found in the chat. Thank you again for being here with us tonight. Have a great evening.